All right, so I guess we should get started.
Yes, yes.
Well, given the fact that we're talking about something called HTML5, one of the first things that we certainly are going to be confronted with, generally speaking, whenever there's something new, is going to be this question: oh, what is it? As in, let's say, what is HTML5? Now, one way of looking at it would be saying, oh, HTML5 is the next generation of HTML that supersedes HTML 4.01, that supersedes XHTML 1.0 and XHTML 1.1. Now, this is one way of putting it, saying, oh, if somebody were to ask us what's HTML5, apparently this is what it happens to be. Next generation of HTML, it's more of a standards-based implementation. Another way to possibly answer the same question could be, HTML5 attempts to bring in a lot of uniformity to features of the web platform. We previously have had a lot of issues given the fact that I believe many of us are familiar with HTML and CSS to a fair extent. We've had a lot of issues dealing with web content and them being comprehended by browsers. A lot of disparity in particular. Standardizing of these features was absolutely a requirement. The reason I say that is we previously had cases where, and it might, kind of sound a little amusing these days, but believe me, this was really a huge pain point for web developers in particular. Just imagine we've developed HTML tags using a little CSS and possibly using some bare bones JavaScript. It works wonderfully well in browser A. When we take the same page into browser B, apparently it doesn't work so well. And if you happen to open this page in browser C, oh, it doesn't work at all. And mind you, we've not done anything proprietary. We've not done anything very specific. It's something that we've implemented according to the HTML specification. There have been so many disparities in the past which have led to concerns. So one of the things that HTML5 is attempting to do, HTML5 is attempting to do is bring in a lot of uniformity. We want to standardize features. We want to standardize implementations, which apparently happens to be one of the things that HTML5 is attempting to do. It is designed to be cross-platform like its predecessors, which is understandable, all right? The latest versions of which include Safari, Opera, Firefox, Chrome, and so on. We're talking about these supporting quite a number of HTML5 features. Unfortunately, not every browser supports every feature just yet. I mean, we're almost there, but we still haven't gotten a 100% across all browsers at this point in time. Having said that, there was a vision document. I'm probably going to take about a couple of minutes here just to give you a little bit of a prelude, a precursor, so to speak, of what led to something like HTML5. There was a vision document published in 2004 by the W3C, which said, hey, look, for the advancement of the HTML standard, we intend to be going by a few principles. These principles will assist in enhancing or bringing in a newer version of the HTML standard. What did these principles talk about? One, backward compatibility. Backward compatibility, which is understandable, I suppose. We would want to introduce something new, all right. At the same time, we would like to ensure that whatever we bring in, whatever we introduce, will not have an adverse impact on what currently exists. Meaning, whatever is currently working should continue to work. That should not break. We intend to bring in some new features, and that is something that we intend to focus on. So whatever new we introduce, it could be HTML, it could be CSS, it could be in the context of DOM, or for that matter, even JavaScript-oriented enhancements. None of these should have an adverse impact on what currently is available. As in, whatever is currently available, that should continue to work, and it should have absolutely no adverse impact on that. The second principle said we would want to have a well-defined error handling, a mechanism which says there should be markup related errors which are handled properly. I'm talking about markup related errors only. I'm not referring to script errors at this point in time. Some of us may be curious, oh, what's this markup related error? Let me take a very simple example. Imagine I want to have a text box on a page, HTML. If I want to have a text box, what tag would you think I'm going to be using? I want to have a text box on a page. So what tag would you think I should be employing?
Input.
Input,
tag.
indeed. Input, and I would say type is text, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Does the input field in HTML have a container tag that I need to use? Let me repeat the question again. Does the input tag or input field in HTML have a container element or a tag that I have to use?
No.
No. Okay. Does everybody believe so?
I think it is a container.
Which is a container?
Input text box.
Is that a container by itself, Vinod?
I think it is storing the value. That's why I'm saying.
Okay, I'm not referring to the value. I'm talking about it from a HTML standpoint. Does HTML require me to add a container, or is there a container kind of an element for me that I should use when I use an input field?
No.
No. Okay. Maybe I would want to just correct your understanding here, because the answer is yes, we need a container, and that container happens to be a form. All right, all of these are expected to be a part of the form. This is according to the HTML specification. Now, I'm going by the specification only. I'm not going by any deviation here. Okay, just by the specification. The HTML specification says if you want to have a text box, it has to be placed within a form. Now, imagine I'm a web page author. I put an input field, I say input type text, I give it a name, I give it an ID and all of that. And for some strange reason, I forget to add a form tag. Okay, it's not that I don't want to, it's just that maybe I've overlooked the inclusion of a form tag. I have not added a form tag. I save this page, I open it in one browser. The browser renders the text field, I get to see it on the screen, I'm happy. After a few minutes, just to cross check, let's say I open the same page in another browser. Now, in that browser, I don't see the text field at all, because the second browser is probably a little more stricter. The first one apparently is a little lenient. So the first one says, when it is going through the HTML, it says, oh, I see a text field. I don't see the form. Oh, that's an error, I know, but I'm going to overlook that error and I will render the text field anyways. The second browser says, oh, there's a text field that has been placed in the document. There's input type text, but where is the form? Now, unless there is a form, I will not render the text field, because it would be like saying you are trying to use a component without a container, and that will sound illogical. The HTML specification says there has to be a form. So the second browser, because it's a little more stricter, I'm not going to end up seeing the text field on the page. Now, cases like these have been far and many. What point number 1 is trying to highlight on the slide is we would like to have a well-defined error handling mechanism. Meaning, if there is an error, I'm talking about only markup related errors. Request everyone to understand that I have not brought in script here. There's no JavaScript involved. This is just one example, all right? The text field without a form, just one example, because HTML standard stipulates that there are things that need to be done in a particular way. Fortunately or unfortunately, we have browsers these days which are lenient. Some of them are not so lenient. Some of them are strict. And therefore, as web page authors, web page developers, or web application developers, we may have to be open to the fact that there could be scenarios where my application is going to work amazingly well in a few browsers, and it is going to hardly work in a few browsers at all. Behavior is going to be pathetic. And mind you, that's for no fault of mine, because there is so much of inconsistency. Those are the kinds of things that we intend to address. So well-defined error handling. This was one of the principles highlighted in the vision document, which said, oh, we want to bring in uniformity, we want to bring in some kind of structure. Thereby, if that text field is rendered in one browser, the person can be assured or will be confident enough to say, oh, okay, if this is working here, it is expected to work everywhere else. I still very much remember, I'm talking about something like close to 17, 18 years ago. We had roughly, we were doing a POC of a web application. And we had about two or three browsers to be precise. And for those browsers, we had something like 5-6 versions of each of those browsers. And you might wonder why 5-6 versions of every browser, because there was so much of disparity across browsers that if I'm looking at a client-facing application in the public domain, it may be difficult for me to predict which version of a particular browser a user could be using. There are so many browsers available, there are so many different versions available. So I've got to ensure that my page works across all of these browsers, across versions consistently. Of course, we have had cases where I'm sure even today you might have noticed some websites which put up a disclaimer at in the footer section of the page saying, oh, this page is best viewed with 800, 600 resolution, and this is the browser that you should be using in order to, get the content properly rendered and things like that. Mind you, in today's world, that is absurd. You can't do things like that because there are going to be clients who might be using browsers that you might not even know of. Imagine the fact that these could be devices. So we've got to make sure that there has to be some structure, there has to be some kind of uniformity, and more importantly, some standardization. To that end, the first principle, I guess, is certainly going to make sense. Second, users should be hidden from authoring related errors. This is where I'd like to bring in script related errors. Till recently, mind you, believe it or not, we have had cases where if there was a script error on a web page, the browser would put up a message on the screen saying, error encountered on so-and-so line number. Okay, now for a moment, just put yourselves in the shoes of an end user. You open a web page, you're an end user, mind you. You open a web page, and a moment later, you suddenly see a message appearing on the screen saying, line number 25 object required. You are an end user. How would you know what that means? Line number 25 object required. How would you know what object there means? These are the kinds of issues, kinds of, I must say, not so pleasant experiences that end users have been subjected to. And this is to a fairly large extent script driven. Fortunately, over the past few years, a lot of browsers have made amends. And now, if there are those kinds of errors, then they simply put up those on the console and they do not bring it up on the screen, which is really fortunate for all of us developers. Every single feature that we propose to introduce should have one or more practical use cases. I guess that's understandable, all right? Because we want to bring in new features given the fact that it's got to be meaningful, it's got to be justifiable. We don't want to bring in features just because our application needs it or a specific implementation requires it. Scripting. This is extremely important. We would want to keep script usage in a web page to the absolute minimum. This may kind of seem a little counterintuitive. Let me repeat the statement nonetheless. As far as possible, I might sound to be really blunt here. As far as possible, let us keep JavaScript usage to the bare minimum. Use JavaScript only when you actually need it. Now, I'd like to believe every one of us here understands that every web browser has what is called a rendering engine and also something called a script engine. Sorry. Every web browser has a rendering engine, and given the fact that the browser in question could support scripting, it is also going to have something called a script engine. Browsers always render content, and if script support is available, they could also have script code being processed, and that content can be rendered, or in other words, the script engine can work in conjunction with the rendering engine in order to make sure that a view is generated that the user or the client can get to work with. All right. Now, what that point on the slide was trying to convey is, as far as possible, you would want to keep the usage of scripting to the absolute minimum, is what that particular point tries to convey. Don't use scripts just because you are in a mood to do so or you feel like. Use scripts only if they are absolutely necessary. I have a question here. Let us just suppose I have been asked to implement a functionality such that a web page refreshes itself every 25 seconds. I'll repeat the requirement again. I am told that I have to design or author a web page such that it refreshes itself every 25 seconds. The user is not expected to be hitting the refresh button. This page is expected to refresh itself every 25 seconds. If this is a requirement that we are presented with, what options or what approaches do you think we could use? I hope everyone understands the question. It's a fairly simple requirement. You might have seen this on a lot of websites, including news sites and financial oriented websites and so on. Yes, Vinod.
We can write a JavaScript function, and within that function, we declare once timer. We can refresh the page after 25 seconds.
Okay.
Loading the page.
Okay. We could load the page after 25 seconds in the script block. Yes, Suman?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. With state immediate kind of or time interval kind of JavaScript, we can write that code.
Okay. Okay. Any other opinion? Yes, Umashankar.
More specific to it, we can use set interval function from again the JavaScript engine, and we can refresh the page.
All right. All right. So we could use JavaScript. We could use set interval, which is going to be recursively, trying to reload the page, and that's a mechanism. Yes, I fully agree. That's something that we could achieve. Any other opinion? Anyone else who may have an opinion? Yes, Ravindra?
We can do the same with the like HTML tag, some HTML tag that indicates to refresh the screen.
Indeed, Ravindra. Would you have an idea?
Sorry?
Would you have an idea which tag? You said some tag, so just curious.
Not sure, but I think some meta tag with some properties, with some attributes that can fulfill maybe this requirement.
Indeed, absolutely. Incidentally, in HTML, there is a meta tag with something like this.
Oh, okay.
This is a meta tag in HTML. It has a property called HTTP equivalent. This is like a HTTP equivalent command, a HTTP equivalent instruction. I am asking the browser to refresh this page. It is like a HTTP command or a HTTP instruction. HTTP equivalent, that happens to be the name of the property. Refresh. Refresh is like saying, oh, refresh the page. And how frequently would you want to do that? the content there says 25. So that's a unit of measurement which is in seconds. Every 25 seconds, you want to refresh this page. Now, many of us opined that we could have something called a set interval. I guess this is something many of us were suggesting, wherein we could define a function, and we would want to have this function invoked every 25 seconds. The unit of measurement there happens to be milliseconds. So I've said 25,000 as in 25 seconds. And in this function, I could probably say location.reload. So I would want to have this done every 25 seconds. Okay, these are two approaches. Between the two of them, now considering we were talking about a point a little while ago, the point on the slide said, as far as possible, we would want to keep script usage to the absolute minimum. Let me say that again. As far as possible, we would like to keep the usage of scripts to the absolute minimum. Now, going by that understanding, I hope everyone appreciates that we would prefer the first usage, which is dealt with by the rendering engine. Now, many of us may have this thought on our minds, oh, why shouldn't I use scripts? I mean, is there something wrong? Can I not look at using the script engine, get the set interval kind of a methodology? Is there something wrong? Frankly, there's nothing wrong per se. However, please keep in mind, the moment you introduce a script block in a web page, the amount of time, the overall amount of time it takes to load that page, parse it, process the script, and eventually generate a view, the amount of time it takes is going to be appropriately a little more when compared to a page which does not have any JavaScript whatsoever. If I have a HTML page or a web page which doesn't contain any JavaScript code, then the JavaScript engine need not even be initialized. It's the rendering engine which has a role to play. It will simply render the content. The script engine need not even be initialized. This is going to help me in ensuring that the page is going to be parsed, loaded, rendered a little quicker than a script-based implementation. Okay, so in today's world, it is absolutely essential that we do whatever is possible to ensure that our page is going to be a little quicker. It's going to be rendered quicker. And this is just one example. So wherever possible, we would want to use the capabilities of the rendering engine. Unless it's a necessity, we probably would want to look at the rendering engine itself. If there's something which involves programmability, which involves dynamism and logic and all of that, okay, in those cases, we don't really have too much of a choice. We will have to bring in some scripting. But for most of the cases, like the one I just now mentioned, currently what we are looking at, I'm sure everyone would agree the Meta is certainly a much more simpler and an effective implementation. Now, if someone were to tell us, oh, dynamically the frequency of this reload should change, it should be 25. Now, if user does something, then I want to change that to 35 seconds, every 35 seconds or every 1 minute. I want to bring some dynamism. Oh, then maybe yes, I'll have to look at this from a programmatic standpoint. But if the requirement only says, oh, every 25 seconds, you have to refresh the page, I'm sure everyone would agree the first option is indeed worthwhile. That is an option that we would want to be working with. I hope everyone understands this. Anything unclear, please let me know, as I said.